Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Swish City. I'm Bruce Velez. I'm starting back my YouTube channel, and in today's first episode, we're going to be diving in looking at three remaining free agents that I'm completely shocked are still available, going over some destinations that they could each land to, and picking out the perfect destination for each one. Without further ado, let's dive into the video at hand. Make sure to grab a snack. And like I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to be going over some players that are going to be going to some rosters in the NBA. So let's look at the teams that have open roster spots. I did miss one of them in this editing, so let me let you know that Miami does have an open roster spot. But the teams in the East that have an open roster spot are Boston, New York, and Philly, Cleveland, Detroit, Charlotte, and Miami. While out west, Oklahoma City, Minnesota, Phoenix, Golden State, Sacramento, Memphis, and New Orleans are all the teams that have an open roster spot out west. That means 14 teams have an open roster spot, and even though some of them might be giving it to a guy that plays on an Exhibit 10-day contract or an Exhibit 9-day contract, I do believe that some of these teams will go out there and pick up one of these three names. Now, I do want to preface by go before we diving into this that a lot of free agents have gone overseas. If we want to look at this list, we can see a lot of guys that have made their name in the NBA or have had some solid NBA contracts have decided to go overseas. Davis Bertans, Montrezl Harrell, Boban Marjanovic, Shetty Osman, Evan Fournier, Frank Ntilikina, Patrick Beverly. And this is a raising concern for possibly an expansion for the NBA or just something at least, because it is desperately needed to not have all these guys go, to have some of these guys that are still available that we're going to be diving into having to sign veteran minimum contracts. I know the new CBA has kind of made these regulations a little bit difficult for some of these teams and for some of these players, but I think as the seasons go on, we'll see it get a little bit easier and a little bit better for some of these teams. But let's dive in. Let's get into these three players. And actually, before we dive in and get into these three players, let's look at the list that we have provided here. This list is provided by Keith Smith, NBA, over on X on Twitter. I was thinking about doing this video last night and sponsoring my YouTube back, and I saw this tweet when I was finding who was available, anyways. So shout out to Keith for always doing this throughout the entire offseason. He gave me a blessing in disguise by doing it one today, and you'll see three of these names picked off this list. And before we dive in and kind of get into that, I do want to let you know, like I said, some teams already have Exhibit 10s, Exhibit 9s. Guys like TJ Warren, Jay Crowder, Nazir Little, and Isaiah Thomas are all working out in training with the Sacramento Kings. So keep an eye on that with a little bit of a tidbit. But like I said, let's dive in. Let's get into all the news at hand today. And let's talk about that first player, ladies and gentlemen. That's right. That first player is going to be Markelle Fultz. Now, Markelle Fultz is a player in this league that I think really hasn't been gifted that full opportunity. Getting drafted first overall by the Philadelphia 76ers and having issues with his jump shot coming into the league definitely set him back in the Philadelphia 76ers and what they were building. Ultimately, it led up to a lot of people thinking Markelle Fultz was a bust until he ended up in Orlando. Once he got to Orlando, he kind of revitalized his career, showcasing he could be a solid defender while also being a pretty decent playmaker and backup point guard for the Magic. The only problem with the Orlando Magic is they have an abundance of guards. Guys like Jalen Suggs, Anthony Black, Cole Anthony, and then Markelle Fultz. It was very difficult for this team to be able to play all these guys. Now with signing KCP in the offseason, it is almost for sure that the door is closed on a Markelle Fultz reunion. So where could he end up? Well, I have three teams that I personally really like that I'm going to be diving into right now. The first of those teams will be the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, the Grizzlies have seen some success with John Morant, obviously at the point guard, and they do have another guard in Marcus Smart. But before Marcus Smart went down, they were utilizing him at that small forward position. This is obviously before the emergence of Vince Williams and obviously G.G. Jackson. But with Gigi having an injury already, who knows what the lineup that Memphis is going to run this season. If Memphis does decide to run Smart at that small forward position, especially to start out the year, I think a guy in Markelle Fultz being that backup point guard and kind of playing a similar role to how Tyus Jones did for you in past seasons would be a fantastic addition. I think he'd seemingly fit right into that role and would be able to excel in that role behind John Morant. And if John Morant does have an injury, at least you have a pretty solid backup. Only problem is if they decide to run Marcus Smart off the bench, I think that kind of eliminates that conversation and ultimately puts them in a not spot. Next is Charlotte. I think Charlotte has a very nice young culture, especially bringing in new head coach Charles Lee, who wants to bring into that culture, especially with having LaMelo Ball having some injury concerns as well at the point guard position. Maybe bringing in a guy similar like Markel Fultz into that role as that backup point guard could be huge. He could start alongside Markel Fultz and play alongside Brandon Miller. He could also be that backup point guard for your bench. And I knew they do have some abundance of guards as well. They have Vasily Micic. They also have another player in Trey Mann, who I think could be really good for this team as well. But ultimately, I think Markel Fultz could be a nice addition and key addition for this Charlotte Hornets team. And then lastly, the team that I think he's ultimately going to go to, and the team that he is pictured showing here, is the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavaliers did just bring back Isaac Okoro, solving that saga a little bit over the last couple of months of knowing if he was going to be a sign and trade or if he was going to come back. And now I think they should put their eyes on Markel Fultz. They haven't had a true backup point guard for Darius Garland in the last couple of years, and they've had to utilize Donovan Mitchell as that point guard. They had Ty Jerome, they had Ricky Rubio retire last season, so why not and go out and get a guy like Marco Fultz, who played a similar role that he did over in Orlando with this Cleveland Cavaliers team. A solid backup point guard who's going to play make, who's going to distribute, help out those guys on the second unit, and if an injury does incur, then he's able to step into that starting role and be a pretty solid starter. I think Cleveland also is in a similar position like Orlando, pushing for the playoffs. So why not want to increase your chances of possibly making a deep playoff run? Fultz and Cleveland should definitely get on this. The next player we're going to be discussing is O'Shea Brissett. Now, O'Shea Brissett was on that 2024 Celtics championship squad and played a pretty solid role on the team, even if it wasn't the biggest role. When his number was called, when he was needed, especially in that Indiana series, he delivered on those offensive boards, and he is the true definition of a hard worker. This man will give it his all, die for loose balls, be that high energy offensive rebounder, and truly fights for every last minute. I was wishing the best for O'Shea Brissett, and ultimately he did not return to the Celtics team as of now. But with the team still having an open roster spot, and I believe the door not being closed, reunion is always possible with Brissett. But in my eyes, I think there are some other teams that could also be looking at him and trying to pry him away from this Celtics team. One of those teams could be a team pushing for a championship out west, and that would be the Minnesota Timberwolves. They do have some pretty solid defenders and rebounders as well with Gobert, Towns, Jaden McDaniels. Having another versatile defender that can definitely play 2 through 5 and help you out, especially on that bench unit, would be huge from Minnesota. I think Phoenix also is another team, especially with that kind of question mark at that backup power forward position. Brissett could come into training camp, earn himself a deal, and insert himself into a vital role for a team that is competing for a championship in a gauntlet out west, earning himself more minutes, earning himself a bigger role, possibly even next season. And I think that would be one of the best case scenarios for a guy in O'Shea Brissett. When looking at some other teams as well, New Orleans, I think, would definitely be able to use him, not having a true vital center at this point, having Zion, having some injuries. We'll have to wait and see what their team does as well. No really backup power forward besides Jeremiah Robinson Earl. And then when you look at some other teams in the Eastern Conference, I think too that we kind of discussed earlier, Detroit could be a nice little landing spot for him, and ultimately Charlotte, which I think is the perfect landing spot for a guy in O'Shea Brissett. Now, you may be asking why a player in O'Shea Brissett would choose to go to Charlotte, and I think that there are some valiant cases. One, like I mentioned earlier, assistant head coach of the Boston Celtics last year, Charles Lee, is the new head coach for the Charlotte Hornets. O'Shea Brissett already has some familiarity with the head coaching staff and can find a similar role that Charles Lee gave him on the Celtics with this Charlotte Hornets team. Now, this team does have some power forwards and small forwards in its way. Brandon Miller can kind of play that 2-3 of Miles Bridges, who they just re signed, Grant Williams, who they traded for last year, and has been a nice piece for their culture. But I think O'Shea Brissett could also ingrain himself there as well. I think he could compete with Cody Martin for that backup 3 kind of role and really could implement himself into this Charlotte Hornets rotation as another solid rebounder for this team, another solid defender for this second unit, and just another high energy guy who could bring some great culture to Charlotte. He's also in the similar age range at 26 years old. This is some of these guys over in Charlotte as well. So I truly think that he'd be able to gel with these guys, really find a role for himself, and hopefully be able to better himself in his career while also giving Charles Lee a familiar face to be able to use in his system. And lastly, the player that we're going to be discussing is Nazir Little. Now, Little was stretched and waived by the Phoenix Suns not too long ago, just a couple weeks ago, and I was under the concern that it was due to the fact that they tried to trade him all last season or this offseason, excuse me, and were unable to do so. Now, Nazir Little, in my opinion, hasn't been given the best tools to succeed. He's played on some pretty good teams in Portland and in Phoenix, and hasn't had that true rebuild to kind of scrape up and kind of show himself to NBA fans who he can truly be. And I think that is one of the main concerns here with Nazir Little. I think he needs to be on a rebuilding team, a team that is pretty bad to where he can showcase his skills and highlight the type of player he wants to be so the teams can buy into him and truly believe in him. Ultimately, there are some teams that I think he could help out. Charlotte and Detroit are some of those ones on the lower tier, which I think he could provide some shooting and scoring as well while being a pretty solid defender. But three teams that I really like for Nazir Little, obviously Phoenix not being one of them due to the fact that they have already waived him. Miami is definitely one of those teams that I think could be a team that could be very interested. They could use that scoring off the bench, and he would be a nice little chippy piece for them to have. And they're a team that could easily rebuild him on the fly if any team's going to. Golden State is another team that could use some wing scoring with Andrew Wiggins not being the best wing scorer from 3 point range. And even though he might not be as good of a defender as Andrew Wiggins is, his scoring might be a little bit of an influx to give him some rotational minutes and spots over there. And then lastly, the team that I think needs him the most is Sacramento. Sacramento has longed for some wings. They have an abundance of guards. And I truly think with them working out Jay Crowder, TJ Warren, and Nazir Little over the last couple of weeks, like I mentioned earlier in the video, that kind of claims that they will want out another wing. That's what their type of role players they want. And I think Nazir Little, once again, is in the younger age, could fit in with a culture of Sacramento. Doesn't have to move really too far away, can stay in the same division, go over to Sacramento, kind of rebuild himself behind Keegan Murray and DeMar DeRozan, learn to be a better scorer and defender from both of those guys, and maybe could be a diamond in the rough for this Kings squad in the future. Once again, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode here where we dove into three players, like I said, Markel Fultz, Nazir Little, and O'Shea Brissett, going over all of their possible free agency destinations and getting their top picks. Like I said, Markel Fultz to Cleveland would be my best nod, O'Shea Brissett to Charlotte, and Nazir Little to Sacramento. Now, I want to know your thoughts down below in the comment section. What do you guys think? How do you guys feel? Where would you like to see these three players? And do you guys think that they will be in the NBA? Because I will ultimately be shocked if these three guys are not picked up on a roster, even if it's a G League roster, by the start of the season. Like I said, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. We're going to get the channel back up and going. So to everyone that showed their support, I appreciate it. Drop down your thoughts down below in the comment section. And once again, I'm Bruce Velez. Have a great rest of your day. Peace out, everybody.